So all of these inputs are going to be going into some sort of mixer. You could have a small mixer, 6 or 8 channels, something like that. A medium mixer up to 32 channels, and then a large mixer if you wanted to add more than 32 channels. And when I say large, it doesn't have to be actually of large footprint. Back in the day when you had, say 48 channels, a typical mixer would be, 6-8 feet wide because there are discrete channels for every input. In a digital mixer, you can get the same amount of those inputs in something that's only maybe 2 or 3 feet wide. So let's start to think about how many inputs that we would need in your typical setup. And they start adding up. If we were to take something like a typical drum kit that had a kick, snare, hi-hat, 3 toms and 2 overheads, and then add some vocals. You've got a lead vocal and 3 backing vocals, and then say 2 guitars and 1 bass, and then a keyboard. This is a fairly small setup, but guess how many inputs this is in this small setup? You're already at 16 inputs. So if you start adding things like choir mics or more than 1 keyboard, and if you want to go stereo on those keyboards and then add some more acoustic guitars and more backing vocals, you can see how you can really start racking up the number of inputs that you'll need. So when you start looking at which type of mixer that you want, here are some of the questions you might want to be asking yourself. It's like, how many inputs do I need? Just grab a piece of paper and start adding them all up. And here's the thing. Start thinking about the future in here. I mean, if you've added up all your inputs and you've got 24 and you start looking around and say, okay, I need something that'll handle 24. Well, I would start thinking about something that would have at least 32 channels, because you know what it's like. You start adding inputs over time. If your band wants to get better, bigger and better, and maybe you have some guest acts that come in that will need more and more inputs, start kind of future-proofing your choice there in terms of your inputs. So err on the side of more inputs than you actually need. Then you go on from there. Is it going to be powered versus non-powered? Now, this is not something you would find in the medium mixer or the large mixer in this thing. Pretty much any serious mixer out there is not going to be powered. But I'm talking about small systems that you might want to have in the youth area, something like that. Some of them can be powered mixers, so that's something to consider there. Is there going to be internal effects? In the old days of where everything was analog, it was quite rare to find internal effects, but most digital mixers will have internal effects built in. And then how many EQ bands? If you've got one mixer that just has bass and treble, or versus another one that has 5 bands of EQ, then obviously the more bands of EQ you have, the more flexibility you'll have. It may not be something that you think about right now, but as you get more and more adept to mixing, the more complexity and the more room to grow you'll want to have in terms of EQ bands. And then how many aux sends are you going to need? In a standard analog mixer, an aux send was a way to send out to effects and then also send out to monitors. Now we'll talk about digital and analog mixers a little bit later on, but basically you want to think about how many aux sends you want if you're going to be using external effects and external monitoring as well, because all of those get sent down aux sends. There's some exceptions to that when we get into personal monitoring and networking and things like that, but basically think about things like that. And then also subgroups. Are you going to be grouping some of your input channels together? Things like DCAs, like standard subgroups or DCAs there. And then analog or digital. The further we get along this course, the less that becomes an issue. Most of the consoles nowadays are digital consoles. But I mean, if you're getting something just for a coffee shop or a small conference room, you might want to choose an analog mixer instead.